Okay, so we are almost 40 now. So maybe we can start, and Fernando or me, if we see someone joining, we will admit them into the room. So before I introduce Mauricio, let me say that after his talk, we will have half an hour, maybe a bit more, for questions and comments or discussions. You can do those questions in 2 or 3 different ways. You can turn on your camera and throw your question or comment to Mauricio. You can type your question in the chat. So I will select some of the questions that are posted there. Or if you are really shy and you want to remain anonymous, you can send me or Fernando straight a private message through Zoom, and we will read your question or comment also. So having said that, and I think we should start. For me, it's a big honor to have Mauricio Antón here. First time I met Mauricio, I started in contact was in my times at the Natural History Museum of Spain when I started to work with woolly mammoths, and Mauricio was really kind on making public available one of his paintings of woolly mammoths for a paper I published in PLOS Biology maybe 12 years ago. Since then, I have been following his work, and indeed, I invited him to the museum in Denmark here some years ago. He also gave a public talk and was really excited about visiting the collections, and more specifically, the collection of Peter Lund in relation to saber-toothed cats. And it was fantastic to have Mauricio here. So Mauricio, it's both a scientist and an artist, and he is linking in amazing ways technology, science and art to basically reconstruct past environments with a special focus on mammals, vertebrates, and hominids. The work of Mauricio has been featured in many different museums across the world, has been also working with National Geographic, BBC, Discovery Channel, and other major TV networks. Because one of the things that Mauricio was doing also was to have 3D technology to reconstruct extinct and extant animals. And that was fascinating for me the first time that I met Mauricio, to see how you can link these 3 different fields and put it in 2D and 3D technologies. Mauricio also does many other things, and one of the things that I would like to join one day are his trips into Botswana, where he is teaching people how to draw and picture extant megafauna in Africa. Mauricio has really influential books. I think his saber-toothed cat book was selected as the best independent book of science and art a few years ago in the United States. And he is still really active in research also. It's has an affiliation also, the Natural History Museum in Madrid. And last year he got a chair in a center of excellence in the United States. In these days writing an application for a center of excellence, and I know it's going to be really difficult to get it, but I'm including Mauricio Antón as one of members of the team. So if we get the center, I hope that Mauricio will be around us a bit more frequently and involved in some really cool activities at the Globe Institute. Yeah, let's go across fingers, Mauricio. Having said that, I think it's time for me to shut up and give the word to the star here today. So Mauricio, the stage is yours.
Okay. So let me now share my screen and begin today's talk. So today I'm going to talk to you. Let me see. Okay, I hope you can see the slides. So I'm going to talk to you about my work as a professional paleoartist and about the different techniques and methodologies that I use in my daily work. And I want to emphasize one aspect of paleoart, and it is that this kind of work is a process. So people, museum visitors or book readers, they see the final result. But I think that if you want to understand paleoart, you have to focus on the process. And for instance, in this sort of collage image that I'm showing you here, you can see from left to right sketches, live sketches of the original fossil bones. In this case, they correspond to a Miocene early hyenid. Then you see a sketch of the skeleton in a trotting pose that shows the animal's locomotion. Then you see many informal studies of behavior, locomotion, and only then we proceed to create that finished painting that we are going to share with the public. So first, a quick definition of paleoart. Paleoart is paleontological art, shortened, and it is a combination of science and art with the aim of creating accurate images of ancient life. And in this case, combining science and art is not optional. It's the only way to do this. So you can see on the left side of the image this 2D render of a 3D skeleton of an extinct carnivore. In this case, it is an amphicyanid, popularly known as bear dog from the Miocene. So this more technological image is showing you the more scientific side of this work. This is the kind of anatomical and paleontological information that is the starting point for reconstruction. Then on the right side, you see the finished product where a lot of artistic work is involved. So you cannot really do this kind of work without one of the halves of the whole. But paleoart is historically a relatively young discipline because historically vertebrate paleontology is also a new science. So if we want to make a very quick sketch of the history of paleoart, we need to remember that even if we humans have encountered fossils for thousands of years, for most of that time, we didn't know what to make of them. If people encounter the bones of an extinct vertebrate, they would normally think that these were the remains of legendary or mythical creatures, mythological creatures like giants, cyclops, dragons, or as in this case, in the case of this image, a unicorn. And the interesting thing about this drawing of the skeleton of a unicorn is that it was created by a scientist, a German 17th century physicist called Otto von Guericke. And this man worked from a collection of fossils of late Pleistocene mammals from a place called Unicorn Cave, fittingly. And anyone with some knowledge of animal anatomy at that time could know that this was no unicorn. If Professor von Guericke had just taken some of the bones of aurochs and bison that he used for this reconstruction, if he had taken those bones to his local butchery, he could find out that they were very similar to the cow bones that the butcher would show him. Why could not he see this evidence that was in front of his eyes? The answer is cultural preconceptions. he was expecting that any strange or big bones found in a cave or coming out of the ground would belong to mythological creatures. So he crafted this strange unicorn skeleton. And this kind of cultural environment only changed about the end of the 18th century, thanks to the work of Baron Georges Cuvier. This French scientist not only was the father of vertebrate paleontology, he established the notion of the existence of extinct species, which before him was simply inconceivable. And he was also the father of comparative anatomy. But besides all that, he was also a capable draftsman. And he created anatomical sketches like the one you can see in this slide, where he reconstructed the life appearance of the new species of mammals that he was describing for science, like this Anoplotherium, which is a creature from the Eocene sediments of the Paris Basin. And so in these beautiful, almost Renaissance-like sketches, Cuvier was establishing the basis of the modern method of anatomical reconstruction. But the method was lost with him because he never published these sketches. They were only discovered in the collections of the Paris Museum in the late 20th century. So he never published this, and the method was forgotten, and it was only rediscovered about 1 century later, independently, by the joint work of American artist Charles Knight, and in collaboration with several paleontologists of the time, like especially Henry Fairfield Osborn. So this kind of collaborations led to the maturity of paleontological art. And one early example is this reconstruction of Elotherium, an artiodactyl from the American Oligocene. So what is this method that Cuvier first discovered and that was independently rediscovered a century later? Well, it is very simple. It is the study of the relationship between outer form and inner frame in vertebrates. And the best way to get familiar with those relationships is dissection. So here in this image, you see the results of my own dissection of a striped hyena many years ago. And you see how this is a very synthesized version, but you see how dissection peels off layers of soft tissue so that we are discovering the structure of the animal from the outside in. We proceed from the external appearance of the animal to the layer after layer of muscle, and we go deeper and deeper until we encounter the bone. And essentially, reconstructing a fossil vertebrate is the same thing, but in the opposite direction. So I like to call it a reverse dissection. So here you see an example from a Miocene species of horse, Hipparion primigenium. And so I have summarized the process in 3 steps. The first step, you see this skeletal drawing. It already requires a degree of reconstruction because on one hand, the skeleton may be incomplete, fragmentary, so you need to infer the morphology of the missing pieces. And then you need to articulate it to assemble it in a posture that is feasible, that is lifelike. So this can be more or less complicated depending on how complete the fossil record is. In the case of Hipparion, it is wonderful because we do have complete articulated skeletons down to the last bone. So that makes it easier to arrive to this first step. So once we have drawn the skeleton accurately in a lifelike posture, we can use that as the starting point to add layers of soft tissue from the inside out. So we start with the deeper muscles, and in order to reconstruct those muscles, our guide is going to be the shape of attachment areas on the bone. So we look at features such as crests, areas with pronounced texture, which are indications of where a muscle used to attach when the animal was alive. So we proceed outwards, and we are ready for the third and last stage of the reconstruction, which is to infer the external appearance. And this is the most speculative part of the process, because in the vast majority of the cases, we don't have any direct evidence in the fossil record of such external features like fur, or say ears, nose, manes. So for those things, we usually have to apply reasoning, for instance, considerations about how advantageous one particular kind of color would be for an animal in terms of camouflage or whatever. We also make phylogenetic considerations. So we review the unpreserved attributes in the modern living relatives of the fossil species. So of course, there are exceptional cases where we have direct evidence, like with woolly mammoths. We are lucky to have frozen carcasses thawing out of the permafrost. Fortunately or unfortunately, ever more with global warming. But generally, we need to be humble and just make hypotheses. There is still another step in this process, which is to take our reconstructed animal and put it in a landscape, to put it in an environment that we need to put together by bringing in a lot of input from different disciplines of science. So we bring in data from palynology, paleobotany, sedimentology, geology, everything that can give us data about what kind of landscape, what kind of environment these animals lived in. Here is another example which allows me to introduce you to the fossil site that we are going to deal with in the rest of the talk, which is a fossil site in central Spain, here in Madrid, called Cerro Batallones. And it is a hill with a series of cavities that function, that operated as natural traps back in the late Miocene, some 10 million years ago. And so in this landscape reconstruction, I have tried to show a lot of information regarding the shape of the land. So you see a higher plateau where those cavities were, and you see in the distance the center of the Madrid basin with a huge lake that existed there. And of course, you see some of the animals whose fossils we have found in the sites. So from now on, I'm going to show you several examples of the reconstructions of different animals and landscape scenes, which I did for a museum exhibition about these fossil sites. So we were celebrating a quarter of a century of excavations at Batallones in the Regional Archaeology Museum. So I was asked to create a collection of illustrations. So let us see a few of those. First, here is an extinct hyena, Protictitherium. This is one of the earliest genera of hyenids in the fossil record. It was a small animal, like a small fox. And this sketch is an example of the advantage of being able to work firsthand with the fossils. So I did these sketches having the fossils arranged in front of me in a table, so I could handle these three-dimensional objects and get a complete mental picture of them, which is so much better than working just from photographs of the fossils. So starting with this, I was able to recreate the whole skeleton and rotate the different segments of the skeleton around their joints to reconstruct the locomotion of the animal. So for instance, here I drew Protictitherium in a graceful trot. You can see the outline of the living animal around the skeleton. Here I have omitted to show you the other drawings I did with the muscles. So after this point, what I like to do is to create many sketches, informal sketches, which allow me to explore the different attitudes, different expressions of the animal, and also to test and experiment with different hypotheses about its external features. So you can see different options in terms of external color and different options for the external ears. Because I had two choices. I could make small rounded ears, as in modern viverrids, which are supposed to be the primitive condition that we could find in a very early hyenid, or big pointed ears like we find in most living species of hyenids. So in the end, I took the second choice, because after all, it belongs in the family Hyenidae. And we don't have direct evidence, but at least there is some reasoning behind this kind of choice. So I was ready to craft a scene, an environmental reconstruction where I could bring in these hyenids and show them doing their hyenid things, essentially scavenging. So you see some of the tricks of the trade, like drawing a horizon and lines that converge in the vanishing point, which allows me to calculate the size of the animals at different distances. So in this very early sketch, I was planning to have a fossil pig that you can see somewhere in the distance, a very crude sketch. But I changed my mind later, as you will see. So from this very crude early sketch, I started to make more detailed drawings of the individual hyenids doing their things. And finally, I was ready to go for the finished color piece. So you can see, finally, I decided to have a herd of mastodons, of proboscideans crossing in the background, because that gave me a more dramatic sense of scale. And also you see the color choices, which I did, which are based on a sort of merging together the external features of several modern hyenids, mostly the aardwolf, but also the striped hyena, and even something of the brown hyena. Here is another of the common carnivores from Batallones. This is a much bigger beast. This is the last genus of amphicyonids or bird dogs from Europe, called Magericion. It was described at Batallones. And with this other example, I'm going to show you the advantages of working not only with the fossils, but with CT scans or optic scans of the fossils, which allow you to assemble a mounted skeleton in your computer. So this was so useful in many ways for creating the reconstructions. So here you can see again this early stage where I do very quick pencil sketches to give shape to the scene I want to create. So here I wanted to show one aspect of hypothetical behavior where adult female, a mother Magericion, is charging a potential enemy to protect its small cubs, which are hiding in a cavity on the ground. So I had this broad idea of how I wanted my mother Magericion to be charging us, but in order to make sure that the proportions were exactly accurate, I had the advantage of manipulating my articulated skeleton in 3D, in my 3D program. So I turned around all the articulations of the segments, and then once I was happy with the posture of the animal, I rotated it to choose the most fitting angle of view. And that allowed me to retrace again my sketch, but now feeling much more comfortable about morphology and anatomy. So this led me to this final stage where I bring in all those other details, all that environmental information that I get from all the scientists working at the fossil site. But this kind of scans of the fossils serve for more than just a reference for 2D reconstructions. And what I did was to make a 3D model in the computer of the living animal around this skeleton. So the way I do it, I still model the old-fashioned, which is vertex by vertex. I move the vertices individually, and the advantage is that I can measure the distance between the vertices in the full body wireframe and the bone inside, which is a much more precise control than you had when just working on clay, say on top of a cast of the fossils. So it's very convenient, and eventually it allowed us to create animations for the exhibition, but that is a different story. So finally, I want to share with you the process of creating one more complex illustration. And during this process, I enjoyed the benefits of the flexibility that digital painting gives to a paleoartist. Because for most of my career, I worked with traditional media, and all my landscape scenes, my finished full color scenes were created in oil on canvas. But the kind of changes that we had to incorporate to this composition would have been impossible with that traditional approach. And you are going to see why. So at the start, the main idea was to create a very dramatic scene involving some of the most spectacular animals from batallones that could be used for a big panel, a mural panel, but also for the cover of the book that would accompany the exhibition. So, okay, I crafted this story where big saber-toothed cat, Machaerodus, and the bear dog, Megarysion, are competing around the carcass of mastodon, Tetralophodon, which may have died of natural causes, whatever, and other mastodons come like to investigate. But because I needed to do a thing for two different uses, and I needed that when the more panoramic view was cropped for the more square format of the book cover, still all the main elements would remain. That forced me to bring all the main elements to the center of the composition, which is not the kind of compositional decision I would make normally, because I like to have big elements of mass distributed around the frame to create a balance of mass. That's just the classic way of composing. But here I couldn't do that. I had to bring together all the elements to the center. So I was uncomfortable with this. So in my next sketch, I tried to add elements that would distribute the mass. So I had these dark masses of trees and shrubs that you can see in the mid-distance. I added another mastodon coming from the distance, a third mastodon, which would probably be left out of the cover, but still it is there. And it keeps my composition a little bit more balanced. Still, I wasn't happy. So I added a few closer trees, which allowed me to distribute in a more balanced way the mass of things around the frame. So this was the composition that I used for starting to work in the color version. So with this raw color sketch, I went to the meeting with the production team, and they liked it, fortunately, but they told me that in order to put letterings, to put titles in the invitation, in the book cover, everything, those trees would give too much contrast. They would be competing for attention with the letters. So they needed a more flat surface. So could I please remove those trees? Well, imagine I had this request after painting this thing in oils. I would be pulling my hair. But because it is done digitally and all the main elements are painted in separate layers, all I had to do was to turn off that layer. So, okay, out go the trees, and I keep working on this version, minus the big trees, and I add all the details, I elaborate the animals, the landscape, everything, and I take this version to the next production meeting. And they say, wow, lovely. And I say, great. But then they say, well, we have changed our mind about the format of the book. So it's not going to be square, it's going to be taller. So we need more space on top and on the bottom. So can you add a little bit more sky, a little bit more grass? And I say, well, yes, I can. And of course, the reason why I can is because I'm working digitally. So I just modify the dimensions of my digital canvas, and I paint more. But imagine I was working on a real canvas. That would be a disaster. So, okay, I obliged. And you see this new version with more sky above, more ground below. And okay, this served nicely for the book cover, which you can see here. And there are more news in the next production meeting, because they had decided that the invitation card and the big canvas banner to be hung out in the museum building would be extra panoramic. Could I add a few more trees and grass on the sides, more sky? Well, yes, I can. So from this version, I added on the sides all this additional landscape, and now I was ready for enjoying, sit back and relax and watch the thing on the museum wall. So that was the end of this experience, of this journey of recreating batallones. Of course, there were many more illustrations I couldn't show you here. But I think it in many ways, it exemplifies the kind of interaction between science and art, between different techniques, even between different departments of production when you are working in the process of making paleontological information available and attractive to the general public and even to paleontologists. So this is the kind of thing that we do. And now I wrap it up, and I'm happy to hear any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mauricio. Has been astonishing as usual. I would love to have one of your paintings at home one of those days. So great talk. I'm sure you're going to have many questions and comments. So I'm going to repeat the process to ask questions. You can write in the chat, or you just can switch on your camera and ask Mauricio straight. So Fernando, for example, I can see your hand is rising up.
That was an amazing talk. Thank you so much, Mauricio. I was just wondering, I'm guessing that, given that you're using so much scientific information in this process, at some point, like the scientific information might change, perhaps because there's new findings, or like, paleontologists maybe say, well, this was what we thought, but it actually is this way. Do you ever happen that you revisit old projects with some updated information, like, or do you leave things in the past and then maybe try new things if any new information comes along?
Yeah. I think that's one of the essential aspects of this kind of work. It is provisional. It is always provisional by definition. So we have to be ready to incorporate new information. But the problem is when one illustration has been exhibited, and especially when it has been published, if I change that particular illustration, it can create confusion, which can reverberate for decades when people are not sure what version they are seeing. So the most practical thing is to do a new illustration. So, and in fact, when a major change comes out in terms of our interpretation of a fossil species, the best thing to do is to come out and publish a new interpretation, so that we state that from this time on, if scientific information makes it advisable to change this image that we had been seeing for years. That the only times when I modify an existing illustration to accommodate new scientific information is before publication. So for instance, now I have a big collection of illustrations of saber-toothed cats for an upcoming book, which I'm not yet certain when I will be able to finish. But okay, I have this collection with me. I have shown some of these images on the media, but they are not officially published. So I feel comfortable with updating them, with modifying them to accommodate new information. But once they are published, as is the case with my previous book, Sabertooth, you know, the book from 2013, well, I prefer not to touch that art so that people won't get confused.
We have a question in the chat from Eileen Lorenzen. Eileen is asking two questions. First one is, how large are these oil canvas paintings from the batallones?
Well, the paintings you have seen here are digital. So all my paintings up to 2004 were oils. So I did several oil paintings for an earlier Batallones exhibition, which was shortly after the discovery of the fossil site. So that was in the 90s. So back then I did 2-meter wide canvases to attain more or less the same level of resolution and detail that you can see in these digital canvases, which are broadly like, well, the last scene we saw, the one with the conflict between the saber-tooth and the bird dog, it was like 2-meter wide digitally, and 150 dots per inch. So that took some effort from the computer, but because it's many layers at the same time. But in that way, I can blow up the image even to that big mural size, because that canvas, that banner outside the building was like 4 or 5 meters or more. But because people saw it at a distance, they wouldn't see the pixels. So, but back in the old days, when I did oil paintings, the normal size was about 1 meter, half a meter for things of detail, and 2 meters for complex scenes with many animals in a landscape.
Eileen also would like to know, how long does it take to paint by hand versus working on digital?
Well, yeah, that's variable, of course, but within that range of variation, I have come to see in retrospect that it normally takes me about 1 month. It usually took me about 1 month to paint in oils, and it takes me about the same time to paint digital, because in the end, my current technique of digital painting is almost like replicating my old traditional technique. So I'm using my digital brushes to go, but the difference is that I can zoom in, and that is tricky, because when do you stop zooming in? You always want more detail. So I have to stop at a given moment and say, okay, this is enough. And so even if digital painting is more dynamic, it's more efficient in several ways, I don't have to wait for a layer of oils to dry so that I can keep painting. And well, in several ways it's more efficient, but because I have always a temptation to add more detail and to zoom in, I end up spending the same amount of time. So for complex scenes, it goes from a month to a month and a half. Ideally, I would spend several months. But in terms of working for an exhibition, working with a production team, it is not practical, usually, to spend more than a solid month with one painting. And I'm always pressed to go fast.
So now we are going to stop and we are going to give Fatima is raising her hand and she can straight switch on your camera and ask Fatima.
Hello, thanks.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. That was super interesting to see. And I have two questions. The first one is about how do you take into account sexual dimorphism? Because you say that you have to speculate when it comes to the outer appearance of the animals. And for example, for this big carnivore that you showed us, you decided to paint a female. Was that based on the material that you had to draw on, based on the skeleton? I don't know if you can tell the sex from the skeleton, or was it a choice that you made because of artistic purposes?
Yeah. In the fossil record, generally, sexual dimorphism is judged based on size, absolute size and relative size of some elements. So for instance, in carnivores, it is very common that males are sexually dimorphic in the relative size of their canines. So the canine teeth of a male are not only bigger than those of a female, because one animal is bigger than the other, but they are proportionally bigger. Maybe because of a display function, we don't know. But it's a matter of statistics, and especially in batallones, we have the good fortune of having several individuals of each species where we can compare, and we can see not only if there is size variation, but if there is a bimodal grouping of size. So if you see that the individuals tend to gather in two groups, two size groups, then it's good evidence of sexual dimorphism. So if you can sex one skull in the basis of size, then probably you are going to find other morphological features, like the development of crests for muscle insertion. Those things come together with size. So for instance, I have here a skull of a saber-toothed cat, and you see this is Megantherium from the Pliocene, and you see these kind of things. This feature that you see here is called the Sagittal Crest. So this is something that varies with size among individuals, between individuals. So a male usually has a more prominent sagittal crest, and an old adult has a more prominent sagittal crest than a young individual, and so on. So so it is possible to sex the fossils and check if this particular adult that we have from batallones is a male or a female. And then there are, in modern animals, other secondary features like the mane of a lion, the colors of feathers in birds. And for that, usually you have no evidence on the fossil record. So I tend to be conservative. I tend not to invent imaginary, because I could just by chance be right, but there are so many chances of being wrong. Because if you let your imagination loose, then you can think of anything. How many ways there are that a male saber-toothed cat could be different from a female. And in Batallones, the big saber-toothed cat, Machairodus, is apparently very sexually dimorphic, as sexually dimorphic as lions in terms of size and development of the canines. So could they have manes? Well, I really doubt it, but they could. I tend to be conservative and just show them broadly similar, those sexes.
Thanks.
You had a second question too?
Yeah, I had another question, which is a bit more general or a bit more philosophical, I guess. You mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that this professor back in the 17th century had these biases, these preconceptions, and so assumed that certain bones would belong to some mythical creature. Of course, you have much more information at hand and you're much more critical and much more analytical, but do you have to fight your own biases as well sometimes? Or do you have some tricks to not be somehow influenced by present scenes or present animals in order to avoid to put that into your drawings?
Yeah, of course. And I think that the area of paleoart, where one area of paleoart where cultural preconceptions are put to the test more strongly is, of course, human evolution. And there you have to take into account your own preconceptions as an artist and the preconceptions of the public and of the scientists, because you know your work is going to be judged. So sometimes you even have to go against your own intuition, because you know who is going to see that piece of artwork. But in general, I think that we have to be relativists, but also we have to be conscious of the advantages. I mean, otherwise we would not be fair to the efforts of Baron Cuvier, who made such a big difference. Because today, if we find bones in a cave, Pleistocene bones, we are not going to think unicorn. First, we are going to compare. So we are in a much better position than that old German professor was. But still, I think the big difference is that now the influence of cultural preconceptions is centered around the areas of the blanks of information. That's inevitable. Wherever there is no information, our preconceptions are attracted like a magnet to those empty areas. But back in the days before Cuvier, even with a lot of information in front of our eyes, we couldn't see, which is sad. So I think it's both things are important. One, to know that not everything is relative, that it is better to have our scientific background than not having it. Because otherwise you would be an absolute relativist, and you would say, well, nobody knows if these reconstructions will be as ridiculous in the future as the unicorn. No, sorry. They will probably be invalidated by new information, but not at the same time. So we have to be humble, but we also have to be aware of the advantage of more scientific knowledge and a more of having walk towards an objective view. We can never be completely objective, but we can be much more subjective. So I think that's the way I see it.
Thanks, Fatima. There are a couple questions more. First one is going to be Casper, and then it's going to be Christy. So Casper is asking you that he loves the Charles Knight mural in the Chicago Field Museum. And he's asking if you have considered making something similar to that mural in the Chicago Film Museum, maybe a European version in Spain.
There are several murals in the Chicago Film Museum, so I'm not sure which one in particular are you talking about. Maybe the Rancho La Brea mural, this general environment at Rancho La Brea with the saber-tooth roaring and the vultures landing.
I was just sort of general interested in if you had any ideas about making like a mural, a big piece like that in basically any museum. Is that something you've ever considered or thought about or been asked to do?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but you know, my first professional big commission, my first big assignment was to do a series of paintings of that kind. I mean, environmental paintings showing the different fossil sites and time periods of the tertiary in Catalonia, in eastern Spain. But back then it was I was constrained by my studio and by the time available, so I did 1 meter paintings. They were broadly 1 meter, and the original oil canvases were exhibited in the Sabadell Museum of Paleontology for several decades. Now that they are outdated and they are kept in the collections, but that's the kind of thing I did. I was trying to, in a way, to replicate the Charles Knight approach, and in fact, I remember that I had a conflict because the company, a private company, was in charge of planning the exhibition, and they had a different idea. They like the big panoramic murals by Salinger, like the Age of Reptiles mural, which is like a global composition where you go from left to right, following the path of geologic time. So you go from the Permian to the Triassic to the Jurassic and so on. And they like that, but I was of a different mind, and the paleontologists at the museum were of my same mind, that it was clearer for the viewers to see one scene depicting one fossil site, one ecosystem, so that you don't have the confusion of these transitions, which are tricky in conceptual terms. And so the people in the private company, the design company, they were adamant that they wanted this big scene, and but the paleontologist and me were of a different mind, and we prevailed, but not without conflict. And so I have had several other assignments, more or less in that vein, but recently they imply me doing a digital painting, and that digital painting being blown out to mural size. And I'm currently involved in a project of that kind for a German museum. I cannot say much more. It's it's still a secret. But it's going to be exactly the kind of thing that you say, with the only difference that instead of oil painting, which would be so enjoyable, but is for many reasons not practical nowadays. Not for me at this point. But it's that idea to show in a big painting that will be exhibited as a mural in the museum, the environment and the faunas of a time period.
Thanks, Mauricio.
Okay.
Christy, would you like to come out and ask your question, please?
Yeah. Hi. So going from oil to digital to 3D modeling, it seems like animation could be a next step. So is that something you're involved in, and is it something within your abilities, or would you then give your models to other people?
Yeah, actually I have done it. So a few years ago, I got in collaboration with a Spanish animation study. So I did exactly what you say. I gave my 3D models to the animators. They rigged them and make them ready for animation. And then we would spend long hours reviewing animation tests, like making sure that the locomotion of the animals was biologically accurate, which is tricky because animators work from routines in the software, and they are not always very accurate in biological terms. So it is something very interesting, which I enjoyed very much, but it's also frustrating because a proper 3D animation, a realistic animation of fossil mammals in their environments requires many hours of work, and ideally reasonably big teams. And the way we were doing it, it was just the two of us, the animator and me, with some occasional help from other people here and there. And so it was very straining. I was very tired after that experiment, but especially it was, in the end, we had to end that experiment because when the crisis, the economic crisis of 2010 or so came with the full swing to Spain, local and regional authorities no longer had money to pay for these kind of things for local museum exhibitions, which was our main target. We were doing animations to show in a screen in a museum exhibition, and suddenly there was no money around. So my colleagues, they had to look for different jobs, and that team was dissolved. And but I never give up hope of being able to do that again. But the key is that, you know, even when you see a National Geographic documentary about paleontology, the animations, the 3D animations may look okay, but I always find them frustrating because they don't have the degree of locomotion and anatomy accuracy and of realism that ideally could be possible. If only we had the kind of talent that we find in any Hollywood movie, just because their budgets are so much bigger. So whenever I'm required from a documentary production company and they say, we are going to do some nice animations, I always shake my head like saying, I'm sorry, but I'm sure it's not going to be. And usually I'm right. Always the results are frustrating because they are working with small teams, with tight deadlines, few resources. So it's something that I very much would love to get involved in, but I'm skeptic at this point that the kind of resources needed for a proper animation will go into a documentary production. It seems to be the province of Hollywood this far. But maybe one day I would love to get involved in that.
Thanks, Mauricio. We're a bit above the time, but this is so interesting that if Mauricio, you have other 5 minutes,
Okay.
we maybe will ask you more questions. There is a question about how do you reconstruct paleofloras, given that many parts of a plant, they don't fossilize. What is your approach for that?
Yeah. Well, as always, I have to infer what is not available from the fossil record. So I'm happiest when I'm working on fossil sites where there are actual macroflora fossils, like prints of the leaves or branches or fruits. Even in some cases, you have fossilized trunks. But in most cases, you have to work from fossil pollen, which is much more common. And then you make inferences. You suppose that the leaves and the more external parts of the plant would be similar to those of modern relatives that live in similar climates. So even if pollen tells you that you are dealing with Quercus, with an oak relative, you have to look at modern oaks and see that if they live in more warm, humid climates, their leaves will be broader and they will have different shapes. So, okay, in the absence of direct information, you make inferences. It's always the same.
Thank you, Mauricio. Is there maybe a last question? Just a last question or comment? Okay.
I have a quick question just as we finish off. Mauricio, are any of your original paintings or sketches or drawings for sale?
Yes, they are. The thing is that I used to have a colleague who organized a sort of online store for me. And so for a few years, it was easy. You just had to go there. But now my colleague had to do something different. And now the only way is to contact me directly in person and discuss what piece you may be interested in. And so I sell a few now and then, but it's not enough of it's not too urgent for me. It's not a priority because I'm always so busy with assignments and commissions. But I'm happy to find new homes for my original drawings and paintings.
Wonderful. Well, wonderful. I'll send you an email after this talk. Thank you.
It will be
so
welcome.
I think we are going to finish here. I will first thank Mauricio and all of the people around. Eileen, I'm going to have a small talk in private with Mauricio now, and maybe Fernando, so you want to stay with us. And maybe to the others, thanks for being here. I'm sure Fernando might have some news about the next speaker. Fernando?
We have Minik Rosing talking next time, I think in about 2 to 3 weeks. We'll send out an email to the Institute about that.
Thanks, Fernando. So thanks to all of you. Please, Mauricio, Eileen, you want to stay here with us for a few minutes, and Fernando also, of course. Have a nice day,
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Anas, also for being here.